let's look at the application of agency theory to incentives, particularly incentive pay for senior managers and executives. Okay, so there are a number of assumptions around pay for performance, and we have them listed here. Money is important to motivate people. Motivation is a central problem around performance. That you can attribute a performance or an outcome to an individual, and that differentiating those rewards leads to higher group or unit outcome. So think about that last one, for instance. It means if you pay a CEO, an individual, you'll get a different group or organisational outcome. Okay, so these are the assumptions. They do, though, raise a number of key questions. Is money a motivator? Is extra motivation the real problem? Can the senior manager influence performance enough, right? Or will it lead to other effects? These are all things that you need to ask yourself and can vary from individual to individual, right, when you're thinking about incentive pay in general. I think when we apply it to senior executives, money is a motivator, but probably not for the reason of having more money. It's more that money becomes the de facto yardstick of performance and to some degree ego, right? The more money you're earning, the better you must be and the more valuable you are. So rather than thinking about money in the sense of money you have to spend, it almost becomes this proxy for how valuable you are and therefore how important it is to you. So I think that it can be a very big motivator for people in senior positions. Is motivation the central issue? Well, again, when we get to the senior management level and agency theory, it's probably not so much about motivation as we normally think about it of incentive pay. It's not like senior managers are going to work harder, right? They're already getting paid a lot of money. They've already got their reputation on the line. Right? They're going to work probably as hard as what they can. The idea behind large incentive pays for senior managers is to encourage them to take greater risk, not to work harder, right? So it's motivation in the sense of what motivates them, interest alignment, but not motivation in the sense of working hard. And I think that there is a greater argument, although, we could argue about the degree of influence, but I think that there's a greater argument that the higher up you go in an organisation, the more you can impact performance. Whether you're solely responsible for it is an entirely different question that we'll come to. But I do think you have a greater impact on the group outcome. So there's some interesting questions, and it means that the way we remunerate at different levels in an organisation or for different kinds of jobs should vary, because the answers to these questions could be quite different. And we see this coming out in the popular press. So we see people saying that no major corporation is a one-person operation. So what that means is, should you just be rewarding the CEO for the outcomes of the company because it's more than just that one person? We also see this idea that sometimes people's view of why people are getting paid is at odds of the people making that decision. And so there's this whole view about whether how much the board should listen to shareholders in terms of the performance. Maybe they know other things behind the scenes that the shareholders don't as to why the performance is set where it is. Okay. So the whole idea about executive remuneration is we're trying to set up an efficient incentive scheme. So the hallmarks of a good incentive scheme are where you set the goals such that the actual performance of the manager is that which the owners desire. So what the manager's doing is what the owners want. And then that the cost of the incentive, right? So think about it this way, is their incentive pay, right, is less than the increase in performance that you get, right? If we do that, we have an efficient remuneration scheme, and we should keep pushing the incentive pay till this equation, hits just below the equal point. Now, we have a bad incentive system or an inefficient system if the performance differs from that that's desired, or it costs more, right? The cost of the incentives is too high. And again, this is where we hear people saying, managers are rewarded irrespective of the performance. They're arguing we're not getting the performance we pay for, and or the cost of the incentive is more than the value that the person who's getting that reward is worth. So these arguments that we see in the press around CEO pay are about the economic efficiency of the pay mechanism. This speaks about this way of thinking about the remuneration speaks as though people are interchangeable, right? We all have the same personality, and that isn't true. So I think we do have to recognise that the CEO's personality, the company context, etc., can influence this. And part of the biggest influence you can have as a board is actually selecting the right person with the right approach to risk as part of that selection process. Okay. So if we say that we're going to reward people for goals, the next question becomes, how do we set those goals? And there's a lot of variability in there. So one of the classics that is the one I'll concentrate on is say, okay, so just say you set a reward around, say, share price. But we know that share prices in general rise when the market's rising. Right? So if the market's rising, you're in good economic times, the company's going to perform better. And really, has the CEO had anything to do with that? Has the senior executive have anything to do with those economic conditions? Well, they're beyond their control. So the question becomes, should you reward the CEO for that rise in share price? So we move from having a target of, say, share price to relative share price, right? So then you go, relative to what? Relative to the market. Well, what happens if your business is counter-cyclical, that you actually do better in a worse market, etc., right? That's going to make the alignment worse. So, okay, well, we've got to think about our company, think about how it moves relative to the market. Maybe it's relative to industry, right? Maybe we should pay relative to our industry. And that all makes sense. But then you find, well, actually, if the whole industry goes down and we don't go down as much, it means we could be paying the CEO when the company's performing badly. Right? Do we really want to do that? So is it that simple, etc.? So again, I've just used a couple of very simple examples to work through the complexity of actually setting targets. So when we set targets, we've got to work out how we measure them, what they should be. Should they be relative? Should they be absolute? What level should they set? Should you set them as company-wide, like share price? Should it be based upon a division if you want to grow that particular division? And really importantly, are there unintended consequences? I think that's one of the ones that boards need to think about seriously. I mean, if you set a goal in a certain area, it will drive certain behaviours. And do we know what those behaviours would be? Again, it's one of the challenges of using outcome control rather than behaviour control. So the point that most boards end up at is this idea of linking the CEO evaluation and REM to the strategy. And this is a very generic style process of where you go through a strategy development. And that strategy then gets translated into KPIs or things the board monitors, right? So if we're going to if we're going to execute this strategy, it means we have to have defined KPIs or defined things we're looking at to make sure we're implementing it. And then if we have them defined, then maybe that's what we should use as the basis for any CEO evaluation, and we should link that then to the remuneration. So we're trying to tightly integrate the strategy with what we actually reward. As well as setting the targets, we have this challenge about how are we going to reward people? Are we going to pay them in salary, as a bonus, perks? Should we pay them in shares? Should we pay them in options? Each of these payment mechanisms, and we'll do some, and that's part of the joy of doing the case that we do, is we look at these different mechanisms have different alignment properties, right? So options are a very high-powered incentive. So in particular, if a risky decision comes off, you get rewarded a lot more with options than what you do with shares, depending upon where you set the options, etc. But in general, they're a much more high-powered incentive, much more than shares. So therefore, options don't exactly align with the shareholder preference set. Okay, and again, we'll do exercises to show that out. We also know that cash bonuses aren't exactly the same as shares in terms of interest alignment. So if we are going to set these outcome goals and then reward for them, we've got a couple of very sticky issues to deal with. What's the goal going to be and how do we set it? How does that align to our strategy? What mechanism do we use to reward it so that we get the level of output that we want? Bearing in mind, we also need to think about what kind of behaviour is this going to change in our senior executive. While we're talking about senior executive pay, it's also useful to think about incentive for directors. Now, there is a school of thought that directors need to be remunerated the same way as senior managers, because essentially they're also agents in a way, and we need to align their interests. So that is certainly one school of thought. There's no clear evidence either way about whether that is better or worse for corporate outcomes. A counter-argument, though, is that what you don't want to do is align the risk profile of the management with the directors. If the directors are a check and balance on management, then what we need to be careful of is that they're not motivated to take risks like managers are. We want to make sure that they're motivated to check what managers are doing and see if there are any flaws. Perhaps not suffer from over-optimism, overconfidence, those kind of problems. And for that reason, directors generally get remunerated at a flat rate. And it's a very similar kind of approach to pay that you would see for judges, for instance. So if you start remunerating judges on, say, how many cases they get through, well, very quickly you'll start getting through a lot more cases. The question is, will you get just outcomes in those cases? So instead, particularly where you want an independent judgment, we tend to remunerate people fairly well with a flat rate. And that's the way most directors are paid, because they're in that check and balance rather than driving the change role. Of course, that can vary with your situation. Startups, for instance, often pay directors via equity. Why? Because they have a different role. Rather than monitoring, it's the service or advice role. And two, the firm is in a situation where they might be able to pay a lot of money. But if the firm does well, the directors get a big payoff, so they're happy to be involved and give that advice. So again, you've got to temper all these general pieces of advice with the specifics of your situation. I'll leave you to have a look at the criticisms around CEO pay. The core criticism is that really you can have all this agency theory, but that's not what goes on, right? What really goes on is that management have captured the directors, and there's no real negotiation, right? It's just that they're all in the same kind of social class and club, and we have managerialism take over, and they just get rewarded no matter what their performance is. So we see problems around golden handshakes where CEOs negotiate huge payouts. Again, a lot of boards will argue, though, that they make that payout because it would be very distracting to have a big argument going on with the CEO. Right? So there's two sides to that story. It's a result of the agency problem, and the Bebchek and Fried article goes into a lot of detail about camouflage, power and camouflage and managerial power in these CEO pay elements. And we can go back to theory and say, look, that's all well and good to have agency theory, but is there really a principle? Do we really just want an economically rational outcome? Do we have unconscious effects when we're negotiating, for instance? So we get poor contracts that are put in place. And I think this is the underdone one, that there are a lot of other influences on CEO pay, right? So when a CEO is getting paid a certain level, they'll have a contract. So contract law comes into it, right? have just done a bad negotiation, but once the contract's in place, the CEO is entitled to what's in that contract, right? And because when they sign that contract, the CEO is negotiating, or the senior manager is negotiating for themselves and their family, not the company. So if there's a failure in governance, it's the other side of the negotiation. It's not really the CEO or senior manager's fault. I mean, I don't know about you, but if the university suddenly wanted to pay me $500,000 and sign a contract, and I sign it, and then they say, oh no, we're paying you too much, we want to change it, I wonder about whether I'd be okay in saying, oh yeah, sure, fine, right, here you go, have $400,000 back. You know, that's the situation we're asking of CEOs. So contract law comes into it. And really importantly, I think equity theory. Right? One of the biggest problems for people is not their absolute pay. It's that they perceive they're paid fairly, which goes back to our earlier arguments about justice and equity. If you're getting paid half of what everyone else who does your job is getting paid, it doesn't matter what the absolute value of your pay is. You're going to think that you're not being paid fairly. And that drives a lot of CEOs, a lot of comparison about how they're going and what they're paid compared to others in terms of absolute value, but also how they're paid. Right? If there is an industry norm of paying bonuses, etc., then most people in the industry expect to get bonuses. Right? There's this assumption under equity theory. And so there's a lot of problems with just solely using an agency theory view about executive remuneration. And I think that drives a lot of the misunderstandings about the pay. And again, I won't go through them, but we have also those classic criticisms of agency theory that might not be accurate, particularly in every specific situation. So there's a quick overview about executive remuneration. It's got to do with distributive justice, and different people have different views about what a fair pay is. A lot of the approach that we have to executive remuneration is driven by agency theory and the misalignment in risk profile and reducing that misalignment. And that then gets translated into how we set goals and remunerate executives. There are some real practical issues when we're setting those goals, choosing the remuneration mechanism, and there are influences other than agency theory on what that should be. So hopefully that's been useful.